Yeah. All right, thank you for coming to the Symposium on Accounting and Politics. When we start teaching accounting to our students, the students at first, they probably think, well, accounting standards, they are developed in a technical way, they are grounded in a well-thought through conceptual framework, they are based on accounting theory. And when students move on further into intermediate accounting and advanced accounting, they realize that not all standards are that straightforward, that sometimes there are conflicting issues between standards. And the reason why is because standard setters and other regulators, market authorities are often influenced or lobbied by interested parties. So, because this is a phenomenon in the world, we thought, well, why not stimulate more research about these issues? Because we have to teach students accounting standards, and it's always interesting if we can talk to students and explain them why we have to recognize something in a certain way and not according to accounting theory would prescribe a certain element of recognition. This symposium, so therefore, we thought, well, let's stimulate research on these influences from the outside world on accounting standard setting, on the accounting profession, and let's go for a special issue in accounting in Europe. And you see here, we'll have a special issue published in accounting in Europe. Guest editors are Begonia and myself, and the submission date for papers is the 15th of October. So we thought, well, let's do a symposium at the EAA Congress to touch upon a number of items linked to this issue, but the issue is much broader. You can also think about lobbying, for example, ESMA, stock market authorities, lobbying towards IFAC, the audit profession. So accounting and politics is very broad. In this symposium, we will mainly focus on accounting standards on financial reporting. So therefore, we've invited 4 eminent panel members, and I will introduce these 4 panel members when they start with their discussion. So the first panel member I will ask to touch upon accounting and politics is Kees Kamferman. Kees is professor at the School of Business, Economics and Accounting at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Kees is also chair of the Publications Committee of the EAA, and he's a member of EFRAG's academic panel. Kees has a number of publications in the area of standard setting and financial reporting, but I think if we think of Kees, the first element we think of are the 2 books he co-authored with Steve Zeff on the International Accounting Standards Committee and the EISB. So the first really huge, very interesting book was Aiming for Global Standards, Financial Reporting and Global Capital Markets, a history of the International Accounting Standards Committee. And the second book was Aiming for Global Standards, the EISB 2001 until 2011. So Kees is very well situated because of his research to be a member of this symposium. And we want to put forward the following question to Kees, in fact. At the start of the 21st century, many governments backed, in fact, IFRS standards to become the global, worldwide, trusted language. Now, recently, if we look at the elections for the European Parliament, or if we look at the national interests, which have become more and more important, if we look at Trump, it's America first. If we look at the possibility of Brexit, and if we look at other evolutions these days, we might think, well, is the current environment still munificent to absorb and to adopt and support global accounting standards? And Have these current evolutions towards more nationalism and the emphasis on national interests, will they maybe have consequences in the end for international standard setting? So, Kees, we would like to know what your view is on the new geopolitical situation and the possible consequences for accounting standard setting and more particular international accounting standard setting.
Yes, thank you, Anne, for having me here, and for talking a bit about the geopolitics of accounting standard setting. And with geopolitics, I simply mean the topic of relationships among sovereign states and blocks of states, especially at the global level. And that, of course, is a very complex topic. So I apologize in advance for some of the gross simplifications I'm going to make in order to limit myself to 10 minutes. I didn't bring any slides, but if you want to, you can imagine a simple slide with 3 bullet points, an easy one, a not too difficult one, and a hard one. And the easy one is a basic hypothesis that any attempt at international accounting standard setting will be colored by the geopolitical context. The plausible one is that we are seeing shifts in current political world order that are likely to have an impact on accounting standard setting. And the hard point, of course, is to predict what will actually happen. Now, I don't claim any particular gifts in predicting the future, so to manage expectations downward, my main point will simply be that we will have to pay attention to these things. I will speculate a bit, but I don't make any hard predictions. Anyway, the first point, the easy point. We have, of course, so far had only one attempt at setting international accounting standards, so we don't have a long track record, but even so, it's 40 years or so. So we can see some notable features. 2 simple examples I can give of how the geopolitical context influences international accounting standard setting. First, Russia. Obviously a significant country, no matter what you look at, the way you look at it, but rather peripheral in the whole effort to set international standards, and I'm reasonably sure that has at least something to do with its geopolitical status. Second example, in the 1980s there was a board member from Taiwan on the ISC, and it was only in 1997 that mainland China engaged with the ISC. And I'm sure there are a lot of capable people on Taiwan, but as things stand, I don't see any of them being appointed to the board anytime soon. So yes, there are relationships between accounting standard setting, the way we do that, and the international political situation in general. Second point, the IASB and International Financial Reporting Standards as we have them now are very much a child of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And they reflect at least 2 important features of the international political environment at the time. I named just 2, there may be more, but I limit myself to 2. And the first is the dominant position of the United States in what you might call the New World Order, post the Cold War and post-Gulf War I. The United States was not just dominant politically, economically, financially, but also willing to assume a kind of leadership role in many areas. And the second aspect of that period is a wide acceptance, a pretty wide acceptance across many countries, of international expert-based institutional mechanisms in support of open market-based approaches to the economy. A long sentence, but a fairly important part of that time period. And the 2 are related in the sense that the worldwide acceptance of expert-based, international, market-oriented institutions had a lot to do with the prevailing outlook in the United States at the time, and also the United States' willingness to support their adoption elsewhere. Specifically for international accounting standards, you could simply say that the United States held all the high cards in the accounting game. It had a very long tradition in setting standards. It had the stock markets where everybody wanted to list. It set the standard for accounting standards and for enforcing accounting standards. It was willing to go with the ISC/ISB, but only when reformed in the light of the FASB as an independent, expert-based model. And around that time, the ISB became embedded, you might say, in a wider set of international institutions representing the Washington consensus, like the World Bank and the IMF. World Bank support for adopting IFRS in jurisdictions has been quite important around the world. There was some hesitation in Europe about adopting IFRSs, but the decision to do that also reflected the prevailing sentiment in the EU that EU regulation, at least on this point, should not be local and political, but part of a global and expert-based solution. But these things, of course, are changing. We see shifts in these two elements, the role of the US and the faith in expert-based institutions. And when it comes to the United States, I'm not just thinking of President Trump, although, of course, under his administration there is a tendency to distance the United States from multilateral arrangements and some doubt about its willingness to play a leadership role in various dossiers. But even without Trump, there was already, of course, a more structural trend to a multipolar world. And I basically mean, of course, the rise of China, but also the reassertion of great power status by Russia, increasing self-confidence in India, and so on. The United States, of course, is clearly still extremely powerful in economic and financial terms. It's still very much at the core of the system. Just think of Huawei. But even without the recent trade war, you could already see initiatives in various parts of the world to create more or less alternative systems, not centered on the United States. And I'm thinking as an example of the Belt and Road initiatives of China. So the role of the US, position of the US is changing. And as Anne also indicated, the political climate is changing in many countries, not just in the US but also elsewhere. It has often been said that today's political fault lines are no longer very much along the left-right spectrum, but along the spectrum of open versus closed, cosmopolitan versus local. We see indeed a rise of nationalism, a loss of faith in international institutions, we see distrust of technocratic elites, reassertion of national identity, and calls for local or national solutions as opposed to universal ones. That is clearly a complex phenomenon in which I try to sweep together a lot of different things that happen in various parts of the world. There's clearly a lot of difference between the yellow vests in France and the BJP in India, but both do at some point resemble a turning away from cosmopolitanism and a reliance on technocratic international institutions. So these things are happening, and it brings me to the third point. What, if anything, does this mean for international accounting standard setting? If you believe that IFRS, as it developed over the last 30 years or so, is basically a good thing, then these trends don't look particularly good. They do bring a risk of the world falling apart into blocks and a retreat into national standards, or at the very least a more reserved acceptance of IFRS with more carve-outs and all that. If you believe that IFRS was a mistake to begin with, of course, then you don't see this as a risk but an opportunity, so there are different views possible. I am of the good school perspective, so I am inclined to see these things in terms of increasing risks to international accounting standard setting. But what I make of it is not my main point. It is that we as academics need to study and to follow this. In the decade following the wave of IFRS adoptions, so around 2003, 04, 05, in the decade following that, there was a lot of attention from academics to study the politics of these things. And I think that by and large the academic literature worked out pretty well how the international politics worked of that period. and that focused mainly on the relationship between the United States, the role of the US and US adoption, and the relation with the European Union, which were then the key focal points in the international IFRS adoption debate. But I have a sense that interest in the academic literature has waned a bit since the main choices around jurisdictional adoption of IFRS were made around 2011. And at that time it may have looked as if we were entering a more or less settled state of things. Maybe we have, I wouldn't mind if we have, but I will venture some speculative thoughts on how the trends which are outlined may perhaps influence ISB IFRS. I don't expect any dramatic changes next week or in the next couple of months, that's not it. I mean, there are some forces supporting the status quo. Compared to 10 years ago, financial reporting has dropped very much down everybody's priority list, also in politics. That may change in the next crisis, we'll see. And the potential impact of, let's say, localism in politics is muted because accounting is not a vote winner in many countries, in no country that I know of. Accounting is boring anyway, most people don't try to think about it, and I'm not aware that IFRS is on the agenda of Alternative für Deutschland, the Lega Nord, of the Rassemblement National. It's not, as far as I know, an issue in Brexit. There's no serious discussion that the UK should get off IFRS once it leaves the EU. Yet, there is clearly a tendency to see accounting standards as non-neutral, as not just technical, as a public policy tool, and thus as something over which national sovereignty must be asserted, at least in the EU. And I can see a scenario, I don't know how plausible it is, but I can certainly see it happening, that the whole IAS regulation is swept away at some point in a grand bargain between populists, the market-skeptical left, and pro-EU reformers who want to save the EU by clearing out a lot of unnecessary EU legislation. In terms of the US versus the world, well, you could ask, well, could US GAAP perhaps replace IFRS at some point? I'm not sure. In the United States, you could think about the possibility that the 20F reconciliation might be reinstated. I don't see this at the moment as something that would really fire up Trump's political base. Hypothetically, it could be part of a scenario of creating leverage over foreign enterprises by keeping them in the US regulatory structure, but then the US has much more powerful instruments to do that. But I don't think the United States is going to adopt anytime soon. The discussion is as dead as it has been for the last decade, as I can see. And therefore, it remains a risk to the ISB's claim to be a global accounting standard setter. China does, or has been, working in a way to create alternative sets of financial and economic institutions, as I mentioned, the Belt and Road Scheme. I don't see it asking or requiring or whatever its accounting standards on countries for which it gives financial aid, if only because there's a translation issue there. That might start to make sense if China gave up its IFRS convergence and really sets up its standards as a true alternative. But perhaps the most likely scenario that I could at least see happening is that the US would accept Chinese GAAP for listings in the United States as part of an overall trade bargain between the United States and China. And that, of course, would double or increase the risks to the ISB in terms of its claim to set global standards. I expect that smaller countries would, on the whole, prefer to choose IFRS rather than, let's say, US GAAP again, because if you want to reassert national sovereignty, you're not going to adopt somebody else's GAAP. So small countries will probably remain loyal IFRS users. You could ask whether the European Union is a small country. Not now, it's fairly large. Perhaps paradoxically, the best chance of ensuring that all EU member states would keep IFRS if the EU were to fall apart. As long as the EU keeps together, you keep running back to the idea that the EU itself might, in a way, develop its own accounting standards. Just some thoughts about what issues there may be. To wrap up, assuming that IFRS survives, I'm an optimist, it will at any rate be in a different world than where it originated. And that will have implications, large and small. Simply in terms of organization, when will China get a second or a third board member? In terms of objectives, will it be able to continue to focus on listed companies and investors freely disposing of internationally mobile flows of capital? And perhaps more importantly, even in terms of scope, it has often been suggested that the ISB should take the lead on non-financial reporting. But I wonder whether, in the political context as I sketch it, it may not simply be prevented from doing that because of the potentially huge political sensitivity of some issues. Think of climate change, think of human rights abuses, about which there is nothing like a generally accepted world order representing a basis consensus in which the ISB could work. So, it's not self-evident that worldwide the economic and institutional setting will continue to converge on something like a universal market-based rule of law type setting that at least implicitly underlies much of today's accounting standards. So let's see how this develops.
Okay, thank you, Kees. Yeah, we invite to the floor Antarka. Well, we all know Anne from the time she was professor at the University of Western Australia, the business school there. She has been for a while a board member of the European Accounting Association, and she attended already European accounting conferences for many, many years ago. She also served as a member of the Australian Accounting Standards Board from 2014 to 2017. And in 2011 and 2012, when she was still at the University of Western Australia, she was also academic fellow at the IFRS Foundation. In that period, she wrote in a very interesting, besides all her other publications, a very interesting literature review on IFRS 8, which was in the framework of the post-implementation review of IFRS 8. And I think that the EISB board members and foundation members were impressed by the quality of her work. And a couple of years later, she was invited to become an EISB board member and joined in the summer of 2017 the EISB boards. Now, we have some questions for Antarka in the theme of accounting and politics. And the questions relate to the previous speaker. So, we've learned from Kees that globalization is no longer considered by parts in society as the way forward, and national influences become much more important. The EISB and the IFRS foundations, for years, they have been trying to mitigate between global ideas and a global way forward and national interests. And so the question we have for Anne is, how does the EISB and the IFRS Foundation try to balance between this global idea, global objectives, and the national interests, and whether she has seen a different way of mitigating between these two extremes over the years, whether mitigating between national interests and the global objective is becoming more difficult recently. And what we also would like to ask is there still a field and environment for international accounting standards, and not only because of societal pressures, but also all the digital and technological changes that are coming towards us in the frame of financial reporting. So a lot of questions for you, sorry, but we're confident that you will answer them or provide us some interesting thoughts on these issues.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for all those questions. Kees has given us a terrific introduction and touched on so many issues that raise questions and are very worthy of responses and consideration. I will try and share some insights from where I stand at the moment on this. So one of the questions posed by Anne, and indeed by Kees in his remarks, is that whether we actually need IFRS now. 17 years in now. for the IASB. So do we still need IFRS in this changing world? And I do think about some of the earlier work that I did when I was at the University of Western Australia, and one of my early papers I wrote with Philip Brown, and it was called Politics, Processes and the Future of Australian Accounting Standards. And Philip, in his wisdom, described standard setting as a, I quote, inescapably political process. And we went on in that article to explore all sorts of political forces that were operating in Australia at the time. And one of the comments that we picked up in our research was from politicians who wanted accounting standards off the face of the national press. And this makes me think of accounting standards and the role they serve, and indeed accounting and the role it serves. Accounting isn't about politics in the sense that accounting, we say it's the language of business, it has a role to play in communicating information in the capital markets. Now, we could say accounting has a different purpose, and indeed we explore that. And in some areas we want accounting to work in different ways. We want it to work for financial stability, for banks. And we wanted to do other things like tell us about environmental degradation and so forth. But if we stay with the idea that accounting reports on business and it reports into the capital markets for the flow of funds between investments, and we need some efficiency there in the capital markets, well, if that's the position we're taking, we want the accounting standards that can do the best job they can without being political. That is, the best accounting standards that can be arrived at by the role of independent experts working with highly qualified staff who can do the best job they can outside of political influences. Now, that was the aim when the IASB was formed in its new structure, as Case referred to. And it continues to be the aim. We haven't changed our mission statement. Now, maybe the world is changing all around us, the IASB, and maybe we have to change. But right now, the mission statement and the focus stays the same. The best accounting standards that we can possibly do to enable the capital markets to function efficiently. That is, let's keep the accounting standards off the front page. Let business and it do its job, let social forces do their job, let politics operate, but if we have the best accounting standards we can that have not been influenced by a political preference for one thing over another, we have some base information that we can then base decisions on. So, to answer the question, do I think we still need IFRS? Is there still a role for IFRS? Well, in the world where we stand right now, I think there is still a role. I'm sure we'll hear about it if our stakeholders don't think we have a role. It has been a tumultuous ride for the IASB, for its board members and its staff over the last 17 years, and we've been talking today with people about IFRS 9, 15, 16 and 17. They complete a very large suite of standards. We have to see how they go as they get absorbed into the capital market. There's a lot of people involved now preparing, using, analysing that information. It's going to take some years for them to get bedded down and for us to work out, are they operating as we want them to and as they expected to. If we can get on with that work without political interference, that would be a good thing. So political forces come and go, and we hear a lot recently about these national forces. And it is possible that people can take a particular national interest and use accounting as one of their tools, in the same way that politicians use all sorts of economic policies to achieve policy objectives. It is possible to do that, and some people do. But what's impressed me in my 2 years at the board is the incredible way national standard setters and representatives of different countries actually can collaborate and work together on things. I find it utterly amazing to sit in meetings and see so much goodwill and so much willingness to come up with a compromised solution that can be used in many countries. So what's behind that? What is behind those people? Well, they're stepping aside from their national interest and they're thinking about a global interest. They're thinking about, if you will, a greater good than just their own self-interest. One of the reasons that the World Bank has become so involved, and Case referred to this, is the idea that economic development lifts people out of poverty. And accounting standards have had a role in that in terms of improving the financial reporting that people are preparing and improving transparency around investments. So there has been this social side, but that's for other people to action and for other people to put in place. It's the standard setter's role, I believe, to do the very best job in producing the best accounting standard they can with the information that they have. One of the things that Case and Stephen Zeff refer to in their book is, as they look in great detail about the development of the IASC and the IASB, is also their reference to the IASB as a successful international organisation. Now, we can debate what that actually means, but one of their reference points is that there are often very few organisations that can reach their goals at an international level. And the IASB has been facilitated in doing that. Yes, by the support of the United States. Yes, by the country conditions that we've experienced at that time. Now, whether those conditions that are favourable to having an IASB continue into the future, that is a point of speculation. But I would suggest to you today that international organisations that can function across borders and are even more important now than ever as we face a world with rising political tensions, increasing focus on self-interest, and the fragility of the environment. So it may be that international organisations in the future have a different form. I'm not saying that the IASB form is the answer to all our problems, but it has some lessons in it that we can learn. Finally, to conclude my remarks, I would like to talk about the IASB as an organisation that has evolved over time. I think that was one of Anne's questions. And you've seen dramatic changes in the organisation from 2001/2002 to now. And it is an organisation that is very engaged with its stakeholders. We spend an enormous amount of time in consultation, in discussion, in listening, and in responding to feedback. So it is an organisation that listens and responds. We don't always give the answers people want, but we're part of a very intense consultative process. In addition, we work with other international and national organisations. So we aren't on our own in this. This is a joint endeavour. I'd like to say it's a joint endeavour to save the world, but that might be giving accounting standards prominence that we don't want. Finally, what about this technology? What about this technological revolution that's going on? Accounting surely is part of that. The IASB is certainly aware of that. How we move in this area will evolve. For many organisations, we're not sure what the digitalisation of accounting actually means for us. In one little area, we're working on our taxonomy, and we know that big changes are ahead with ESMA and the mandate to use the IFRS taxonomy that's coming very soon in 2020. So we know that change is needed in this area, and we're going to be part of that, but we're not going to get there on our own. We're going to get there in consultation with all our stakeholders, and that certainly means the academics. So we appreciate your input, all your hard work on research that relates to IFRS. Please don't be disheartened by our panel today and all the negative stuff about globalisation. Please don't be disheartened. Please keep working and feeding through your research. Thank you very much.
So the next speaker is Saskia Slomp. Saskia has been working from January 2010 until now at EFRAG. First of all, when she started at EFRAG, She was the governance and administrative director of EFRAG, and from the 1st of April of this year, she became, or she's appointed, CEO of EFRAG. Before joining EFRAG, Saskia Slomp was working with the Fédération d'Experts Comptables Européens, which is now called Accountancy Europe. And Accountancy Europe was one of the founding member organizations of EFRAG. So Saskia Slomp is really well positioned to know how political interest from the EU with respect to financial reporting evolved over time. Saskia Slomp is also attending EAA conference for many, many years. She reminded me yesterday that when the European Accounting Conference was in Antwerp, in 1998, she was on a panel discussing accounting for financial instruments. So, I mean, she knows a lot, many of you, and she's been around at the EAA already for many times. You can almost guess the questions we will ask to Saskia Slomp, being so well aware of what happens in Europe and European politics. So we focus now from the focus now goes from the EISB more towards Europe and the EU. I mean, the European Union decided with the IFRS regulation to require mandatory adoption of the IFRS standards by European listed firms. Some countries also made IFRS for SMEs or IFRS mandatory for non-listed firms. But with respect to listed firms, we have the issue that standards have to be endorsed in the European Union and they have to be judged according to this concept of the European public good. And our first question is, well, this concept of the European public good, is it still interpreted in the same way as it used to be in 2005 when IFRS standards were first endorsed in the European Union? Or are different political pressures present today, and do they want another interpretation of the European public good? Second question is also, has the interest of politicians with respect to financial reporting increased? We now see the Directive on Non-Financial Information. EFRAG recently established a corporate reporting lab. So what kind of evolution do you see with respect to European politicians versus financial reporting in Europe?
Okay, thank you, Anne, for this kind introduction and a large number of questions. I think, and I want to thank as well Begonia for inviting me. And I must say, when they first asked me to come to speak about this topic, and I'm the only non-academic in this prestigious panel, so lacking any academic experience, I thought, that's a difficult topic. What can I say about this topic, and is that not dangerous? So I have decided here to speak in personal capacity. Of course, I have all the background. I've been almost 30 years in the European scene, as some say, in the Brussels bubble, so basically saying that we are a bit isolated there in Brussels. So I will bring some sort of reflections, and I think by doing that I will address most of the questions that have been asked. And I will do that, of course, from the experience I have, both in FI at the time, Accountancy Europe, and EFRAG, but I'm not speaking on behalf of EFRAG, or EFRAG has no position on this. So I just wanted to make that clear up front. I think Anne said, accounting is not about politics and it should not be political. If I look back, then there has been a large change basically from purely technical. Accounting has been influenced, or at least politicians have increased interest in accounting, and that over time. It's also a question, what is politicians, what is politics? So I'm going to address that basically from the European angle, from the European Commission, European Parliament, and perhaps a bit of the governance, like Kay said. Coming to the IS regulation, before the IS regulation was in place, we did, and I said we did, at the time I was at FEE, we were asked to do some studies about sort of the choice between IS and US GAAP, and listening to cases, the choice might come up again. So at the time there was a sort of, that was not strange to do because you had all these German companies that were applying US GAAP like that. So we had to do a whole study, and then the conclusion was, yeah, we have to go for IAS because that's actually something that Europe could potentially be influencing and could be part of. The IS regulation was also a novelty in the sense that we in Europe would suddenly have the standards of a private international organization. Whereas, I think Kees was also referring that there's some possibility for the future. Europe always had European standards, European directives, European legislation, directives to be implemented and so on. So suddenly there would be international standards. So Europe decided to have this endorsement mechanism, and in that mechanism actually the Parliament is involved, the Council, that's the government is involved, and of course the Commission. And that's actually so where EFRAG comes in. And if you go back to the IS regulation, actually, it's not EFRAG that's mentioned there. It's talking about an accounting committee. It's not talking about EFRAG. In later legislation, it's EFRAG, so we had to find our way. So we are, as EFRAG, we are bringing the European influence in the international standing setting process, and we provide endorsement advice to the Commission. And this endorsement advice has also developed over time, and I'll come back to that. Another novelty was that, of course, by having the IS regulation, IAS, or now IFRS, has become part of legislation, of European legislation. But that means actually that it had to be translated in all these languages of the European Union. And what it means as well, that if somebody were to go to court, it's not the IFRS book, the red book, that applies. No, it's the way it has been translated in the language of your country. So, the IS regulation has been evaluated a number of times, and we'll come back to the so-called fitness check, but there was also an evaluation after 10 years, IS regulation. I think a sign as well that politicians, Parliament and so on, take a real interest in the IS regulation is the fact that this is one of the very few regulations that has not what they call Lisbonized. And Lisbonized means that actually there will be a different mechanism. You will get either delegated or implementation act, and then the Parliament has far less power. So far the Parliament has blocked it. They want to keep their power. I think some of you mentioned already the financial crisis. I think that's the first time I can remember that actually accounting came on the agenda of the G20, but also of ECOFIN a couple of times in 2012, 2013, so a bit after the crisis. I agree in the sense that it has calmed down with Kees, but I think it's, if you look to the Parliament and so on, it's coming up again, and I will refer to that. If we look at EFRAG and perhaps a bit at the IFRS Foundation, another point was that in 2010, the European Commission decided to co-finance EFRAG and the IFRS Foundation and the PIOP. So suddenly we moved from a purely private organization, EFRAG, to a public-private organization. We are formally, legally, we are a private organization, but the money, part of the money, and a large part of the money comes from the European Commission. So is that politics? I don't know. Is that impairing our independence? No, we think we are an independent technical body. But of course, if the Commission asks us to do certain studies, we have to do them. We cannot say, no, we are not doing those things. So it's not that easy. Also, this finance brought a lot of accountability. We have accountability function towards the Parliament, but also towards the Council. And the Commission has to provide every year detailed reports about what we are doing. So, is there influence of politics? I think there may be. Then another, I think, point where we should look at, if I again come from the perspective of Europe and especially EFRAG, that is the reform that we had in EFRAG. We had many reforms, but I want to refer to the Maystadt reform. The late Philip Maystadt is a former Belgian finance minister, so a politician, and he was also the president of the European Investment Bank. He was asked to review the whole structure from EFRAG, not by us, but by the European Commission. And he wanted to have an all-inclusive model, as he mentioned it, with all standard setters involved, with also what we call the ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities, so ESMA, EBA, EIOPA, and the ECB involved, because his idea was if you bring all the important players in Europe together in this so-called EFRAG board and make them to decide in consensus, then there is only one European view going to the ISB. Well, this was perhaps wishful thinking, because in reality this is not entirely what happens, of course. First of all, ESMA, EBA, and so on decided that they didn't want to be members of this board, but they said we will be observers, because as observers we have our own possibility to give our own views. And also, what Philip Maystadt had foreseen is that there would be only one view towards the ISB. In reality, that is also not true. EFRAG is bringing its view, all our member organizations are almost bringing their view, perhaps not the smaller ones, but perhaps the EFRAG view has a different weight. Another sign is that in this reform, this was decided that the president of the EFRAG board, which is probably the most important function in our organization, is on nomination by the European Commission after consultation of the European Parliament and the Council. The EFRAG board, which has been put, say, over the EFRAG tag, the technical expert group which we had, was asked to look beyond technical issues. And here is the phrase European public good, which will come in. The EFRAG board was asked not only in the endorsement advice, but also wider to look at this European good, public good. What is the economic and strategic impact of certain standards? How can that be considered? So this whole wider task, moving away from just technical, was very, very evident. In the European public good assessment that EFRAG has to do for the endorsement advice, you mentioned already, we have to look at financial stability. Actually, it's a sort of negative insurance. We have to look at if a standard is not undermining financial stability, economic growth, and if it's not hampering competition. And then since recently, basically in the action plan, but also in the high-level expert report, it's called upon the Commission actually to request EFRAG to consider in its endorsement advice, where applicable, also the long-term investment and sustainable finance. And indeed, in our endorsement advice on request of the Commission on IFRS 17, insurance contracts, we are asked to look at the long-term investment element. And in addition, we perhaps mention, my colleague Filippo is sitting there, and he is very much involved in that project that we are asked to do on equities, where we actually have to look into the impact on long-term investments of the fair valuation of equities. Another element that was brought by the Maystadt reform was the impact assessments. Whereas in the past they were done by the Commission, we had to do them from 2014 onwards, 2013 onwards. And we did the first full-fledged pilot on the impact assessments for IFRS 16. We also have now, for the first time, done an early stage analysis on the FICE project. So these are all new elements which actually look at an early stage at the impact of standards. Is that politics? Well, it's not just technical. And then the last thing to mention in the Maystadt reform was that it was decided that there should be a sort of rapporteur of the Parliament, of the European Parliament, that would be a sort of direct relation with EFRAG and perhaps also with other parts with the ISB and so on. The way they actually implemented that was they decided to have a committee. They called the IFRS Permanent Team. So that was established in 2015. Many of you may know that it was chaired by Mr. Stolojan, which is quite a famous name. Now the question is, with the new parliament, first of all, will this group be re-established? We don't know. Many of the people, the focal people in that group, were not up for re-election, so there will be certainly a new committee. In that committee you have of each political group one person, And we were, in a way, it was actually quite good that in that group you had all the, if I can call it between brackets, difficult people. So if we had to dialogue with them, and I guess it will apply the same for the ISB and for others, then sort of in econ it will go much more smoothly. That brings me to the Parliament. Again, the Parliament is much more involved now in accounting than it ever was. When this whole process started of endorsement of the IS regulation, actually the Parliament did nothing. They had 3 months to react on every standard, and that period just passed, nothing happened. So for years it was like that. And then actually with financial instruments it started to change. They had a public hearing on IFRS 9. We had in 2016 the so-called Stolian report reacting to the evaluation the Commission did on the IS regulation. We had a European Parliament resolution in 2016 on IFRS 9. We had one on IFRS 17 in 2018. There are regular exchange of views between Econ and the ISB. And also since recently they have installed that as well for EFRAG. And we were in May 2018, we had our first presentation to the Econ. Now, that sounds very, very good, and it's also very good that that possibility is there and is actually a requirement. But you have to imagine that, I don't know how many MEPs there are, actually I didn't look it up, but there are something like 700 or 800, and then you have 5 or 6 in the room, and that is all you get. But that's the one that are interested in accounting, and apparently they have quite some influence. Another thing with the Parliament is, of course, the people that come to the Parliament, where do they get the information from? Where do they get the concerns, the complaints from? That's all those people that are not happy with certain things that happened. The ones that are happy are not coming. They're not telling you, oh, this is such a good standard. No, they're only coming, this is a bad standard. So there is political influence on the accounting standard setting process. Do we have 2 more minutes to talk about the fitness check? Because I think that was also one of the questions, and certainly a case referred to carve-ins, carve-outs, and that sort of thing. So the Commission did this fitness check. They basically looked at all reporting directives and regulations in 2018, and they came with the summary report in November 2018. And if we focus on the IS regulation, the conclusion was the majority is against the European conceptual framework. So otherwise there would have been a European conceptual framework that could be different from the ISB financial framework. So then there was a question about carve-ins. The majority is against carve-ins, but there are huge differences in countries. If you look at France, and I think similar things apply for Spain and Portugal, I don't know about Italy, but 75% of the respondents, the French respondents, were in favor, whereas 15% in Germany, UK, Netherlands were really in favor of a carve-in. If you read the report of the Commission, then there is actually a lot of attention for the reasons why people could be in favor of carve-in. So I don't know if that's a signal or not for the future, what is happening. There was also a question about this, if people would be in favor to address sustainability and long-term investment policy objectives, and there the majority was positive about that, but also the majority said it's perhaps not needed to make that explicit in the European public good and put that explicit in the IS regulation. It's basically the Commission can ask about the thing when they put an endorsement advice request to EFRAG. So probably it will not be included in the European public good, because the European public good is a very wide concept. It can embarrass almost everything. So what are the expectations? We don't know exactly. We know there will be a staff working document coming out before the summer. We also know, of course, that we have the new Parliament now. We will get a new Commission, so any legal action, the Commission is telling us, will not take place before 2021. Will Europe continue to support global standards? We have a carve-out already. We have a top-up. Will we get carve-ins? We don't know. If we get convinced, what would that mean? Is that immediately European standards? So a lot of questions, and of course we are facing, I dare to say, a difficult endorsement advice process on IFRS 17. Then perhaps to very briefly mention the HLAC report and the EC action plan. I think that's again other signs that politicians get more interested in accounting. There you have specific references to the financial instruments, to IFRS 9, the establishment of the European lab. We were asked by the European Commission to establish this European lab, actually not to move towards legislation in corporate reporting, but to stimulate innovation by finding good practices. And we are in the very, very early days. We have just established that lab agenda. We set up the whole governance, and we established the bodies at the latest, the task force in February, and we have just started our first project on climate-related reporting. So again, are there politics inside? Well, the steering group, the chair is our EFRAG board president, the vice chair is the head of unit of the Commission dealing with reporting. So it's all intertwined, I want to say. So in the end, to conclude, I just want to say yes, in sort of my experience, I see very much an increase if I speak over a period of 30 years, there is enormous increase of involvement and interest of politicians and politics in the accounting standard setting process. If it's right or wrong, I leave to you to assess. Thank you.
So we're now coming to the last member of the panel, Stefano Zambon. Stefano is professor at the Faculty of Economics of Ferrara. He's also involved in EIA activities for a long time, and in fact we know him as Mr. Intangible Assets, because he organizes a lot of workshops on intangible assets, and in that capacity he was involved in many working groups like the EU, the OECD, and therefore he's well aware of political influences on certain projects. We learned from the last speaker that indeed the influence of politicians and EU politicians on financial reporting is increasing. They are much more interested into financial reporting, and if we look at the European Parliament these days, they're not only interested in strictly financial reporting, but they also become interested in wider corporate reporting. For example, tax transparency, country-by-country reporting. So the focus of interest of politicians is becoming broader, and also they want to influence the broader area of corporate reporting, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you very much, Begonia, for this invitation, Accounting Europe. I just would like to, there are too many answers and too many complex for a confused accountant like I am. So I would like just to address a few of the issues you mentioned from a slightly different perspective. First of all, I just pose to myself the simple question, what exactly accounting politics, how can be addressed as a topic? And I remember my old mentor, Anthony Hopwood, that used to make a distinction between politics on or around accounting, so European Parliament, the politicians, just what Saskia well described, and the politics in accounting, within the accounting and within the organizations. So this, some of the choices, some of the politics taking place in the various organizations have a big influence on many people. So as a possible themes for the special issue, I think this is the topic today as well. I would like to discuss a little bit about, coming from a slightly different perspective, of politics in accounting. And just to be sort of more theoretical, sometimes I remind to myself that I'm a professor, so I think that there are at least, I don't want to say the whole thing, but 3 interesting approaches from a theoretical perspective from which to look at the political processes in accounting. There are, of course, territorial claims. That's the Anthony Hopwood old approach. Legitimation strategies, and, of course, social networks. There are different perspectives, once again, theoretical perspective from which to look at political processes in accounting. And I would like to give you three short examples, maybe to some extent hopefully controversial, because we are also here to discuss and debate. So three quick case studies about three different aspects that I would like, personally, I would be very interested to understand more about these three possible areas. So IFRS, I agree with all what Anne said, and Tarka said about IFRS. I think it's a very successful organization with great achievements. I think there's also a quite important element of procedural legitimization. So the due process is part of the source of somehow the credibility of ISB. And of course, also all the selections that are taking place is following board members, following a certain procedure that is stated. I think, though, that it will be very interesting to know more about what are the candidates, for instance, to ISB. Because I think at the moment it's quite strange that such a strongly procedural organization, which is, as I said, a very great strength, a very great adds to reputation. It's very strange that when there is the selection process, we're not really sure what is coming. It becomes a little bit of a black box. So in this respect, clearly there's a space for the political processes occurring, and I think that will be an interesting element for studies in a special issue. Somehow trying to understand more what is going on in such an important organization, important for worldwide organization, in the selection of the board members. And once again, it's nothing personal. Just I think it's when we are in the universities, and of course there's a selection process also in universities. And I think the political processes in accounting organizations can be quite an interesting topic per se. In fact, some lack of transparency, as we know, that caused a quite complex dialectic sometimes with the European Parliament over the last 10 years. Another case, which is probably relatively new to you, is the corporate reporting dialogue. We move into the wider corporate reporting. We leave for a moment, of course, financial reporting, because many of the most interesting processes taking place nowadays regard wider corporate reporting. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this disaster that there are so many organizations dealing with corporate reporting. So when we talk about corporate reporting, it's not very clear what do we mean exactly by that. So there are some of them, some with completely different origins, governmental support, non-governmental support, with different, of course, focuses and so on. So it's not surprised that even if we have the directive, as you know, the non-financial reporting directive, that didn't help too much to create some order, because, as you know, the directive uses a principles-based approach. The principle-based approach basically leaves companies free to choose which is the best way to address non-financial statements. And so what happened is even more complex than that, because this is a McKinsey slide just created last month. And here they put the supporters, so basically money, financial supporters, who support what, and of course the board council members that can be a little bit, exchanged. So basically there are three supporters: Bloomberg, Ford Foundation, and Rockefeller Foundation. And all these organizations get money from the three major funders. So, and the board, and of course, and this creates an interesting kind of map. And also this, I think, is an interesting thing, because many of the members of one organization are also members of another organization. I think in financial reporting, in corporate governance, we would call interlocking directorates. And So I think that is a very complex situation, as you can imagine. So they tried now to, just as a short history of reporting in the world. Basically, this is financial reporting with ISB and International Evaluation Standards Council. And this is non-financial reporting, sustainability and value creation. And basically what they decided to do to try to solve the soup we just seen is to create a corporate reporting dialogue on the sustainability issues, trying to somehow better align the frameworks, the models on the sustainability, also in the hope to create a more credible statements, of course. So basically they created this corporate reporting dialogue, trying basically to respond to market calls for greater coherence, consistency, and comparability in the field of sustainability, so socio-environmental sustainability. And this proposed, it's quite interesting because the corporate reporting, the first thing they did is produce a corporate reporting landscape, which is a very landscape map, which I think is a great idea to have a map just to orientate yourself like in this difficult field. And the interesting thing is that each of these organizations have shown to you, they put, they put in writing the purposes, the scopes, the contents of each of them. So marking somehow the territories. So they basically claiming that certain territories in terms of purposes, scopes, and contents belong to them. So this is what, so this is the landscape map. This is the purpose. Just so each of these organizations help, provide a description of what they are, the purpose. And after there's a description of the scopes, and after there's a description of the contents. So it's an interesting example, I think, talking about accounting and politics, how, the territories are marked, are defined, and there are, of course, some claims on these territories. So Carbon Disclosure Project is about carbon footprint. Climate Disclosure Standards Board is about climate disclosure. Of course, inside this interesting exercise, there's also ISB and also FASB, which is, of course, increases the interest of this exercise of the landscape map. So the question here is it possible a better alignment? So they started amid these frameworks. So they started this project of better alignment, not on an alignment, but a better alignment project. Clearly, please remark the important difference between better alignment and alignment. And so, of course, and this is an interesting political project, trying to get all these frameworks together. So I think that might be also an interesting topic. Only 5 of them. Only 5 members of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, CDP, CDSB, GRI, IRC, and SASB, got together to in this particular exercise of better alignment. They discussed about sustainability reporting, integration of information, and of course, the Financial Stability Board's task force for climate-related financial disclosure. So it's a very ambitious project, very political. Couple of weeks ago, I was in London with Saskia, and there was in the sense that we were at the IRC conference, and there was clearly a statement of the political difficulties because of the territorial claims of all of these organizations. And finally, let me just provocatively suggest some of the possible topics that might be of interest, talking about politics in accounting and within accounting organizations. Well, the EA, of course, is a very successful organization. I belong to this since 1988, so I'm not really a newcomer. So why not to choose European Accounting Association as an object of study from a political perspective? I haven't seen too many papers on this. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have a very distinguished colleagues here. And so, for instance, an interesting aspect will be how the succession, how the presidents, how the members of the management committees are selected. Also here, there's a bit of a not publicly available criteria. Maybe there are, but I personally don't know them. And so also this might be an interesting way to address accounting and politics. Clearly, considering the fact that, and I'm going to close in 1 second, considering the fact there's a strong co-optation model, because it's the president choosing, selecting, basically suggesting the members of the management committee. So there's as I said, this creates probably a strong co-optation model, I guess. So why not apply social network theory in this context? I think Granovetter's old paper on social network theory could be an interesting approach also to explore new ways to look at accounting and politics. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll try this one. We heard all the 4 panel members, and because of the time, I'm going to give immediately the floor to the audience, and I'm not going to ask panel members to react to each other. So, floor is open. You've heard the 4 panel members. Questions you have on your mind with respect to themes that have been tackled, well, you can ask them to our panel members. So, are there any questions in the audience? And I have to apologize because the light is really shining in my eyes, so it might be that I don't see the hands that are raised. So if you have any question, please raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. Yeah, I see a hand there. Yeah. A mic is coming to you. Just, yeah. Can you introduce yourself, say your position?
I thought I just did, but it's Demi Demirag. My question is really about the subject of the special issue. It seems to me that most of the speakers have really talked about international accounting, international politics. I am wondering if the subject areas could include governments using accounting in the public policy. So, for instance, what sort of technologies governments are using in terms of achieving their own economic and political objectives. Would that be something that you would be interested in?
Sure, that is in the remit of the special issue. So in the beginning I said, well, it is much broader than the themes we will tackle here. You can also imagine about influencing ESMA or the subject you just mentioned. I mean...
So it includes the kind of management accounting aspects of it. Thank you, that's fine, yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
Rob Larson, Cincinnati. This is a question for Anne. The EU, when they do proposals, generally publishes in multiple languages. The United Nations generally publishes in multiple languages. With the ISB, they've been primarily doing English with occasionally translation in other languages. Do you think the ISB might move to a process where the proposals are in more languages so more people can participate?
Rob, just repeat your last sentence for me.
Do you think that the ISB might, in fact, move to a way where they put proposals out in more than just English on a regular basis and or give more time for responses so that maybe more people could participate?
The pronouncements of the IASB do get translated. So as part of the European Union, there are official languages. And so as part of that process of consideration of the pronouncements and then the process of endorsement, the pronouncements are put into the languages of the European Union. And then in addition, other countries also work on translating. So really your question is whether there's enough coverage and whether there's enough time for people to respond. Is that right?
I'm sorry, I meant more the proposal stage, when you're discussing new standards or revising existing standards, before they're made official. Exposure drafts and such.
Yeah. I think we have a process where certain key documents are translated and people can access them. There are issues around translation of which the IASB is aware and has become aware. So there are processes where the IASB is giving it more attention to language than perhaps in the beginning. Given the complexity of accounting standards and the use of language, all the thought that goes in trying to make them as clear as possible in the English language, it does add another layer to the documents themselves as we try and get them either, in some cases we're assisting with translation, in other cases they're being done independently by official translators. So I recognise that that does complicate the process, that we use a number of languages. I think a lot of people do access the documents and comment on them through the English versions rather than the translation versions. But I think it's something that we have to work with. So I haven't got a good answer for your question. I think that we have to continue working with multiple languages, and that does involve time delays and possible difficulties with the interpretation of the English that's used.
Any other question from the audience? So you can think about a question. So now I refer to the panel, and I would like to ask, are there some points that were made by other panel members where you would like to react on? Yep. I'll take this one.
No, it works.
It works? Okay.
No, just as a comment, of course, accounting politics can be very large. So I think it's a great topic, and but also as academic, we should also try to mobilize interest in the ways accounting and politics intertwines in various organizations, especially when the organizations affect large chunks of communities and so on. So I think it's a very, very nice topic, but I think we shouldn't be concerned to address also controversial issues. That will be, because accounting and politics are intertwined nearly, not genetically, but nearly. So that would be my general comment.
Okay, in the meantime, other question of the audience? Oh, okay, yeah.
Well, let me add to what Stefano just said. Yes, there is a kind of inevitability about accounting and politics, so there's nothing, let's say, inherently wrong about accounting, a political role in accounting or an influence of politics in accounting. That's kind of natural. I mean, I remember having a colleague who said to me just before the EU was going to adopt IFRS, and there was talk about this endorsement mechanism, this academic colleague said, well, we can't have this because before you know it, accounting standards will be traded off against fish quota. And he was almost offended by the idea. Well, my initial response was that the fish had as much right to be offended to be traded off against accounting standards, but more importantly, there isn't anything inherently in accounting that sets it off by definition from politics. Because politics, by definition, defines its own boundaries. Setting the boundaries of politics is itself political. So you can't say, from an apolitical point of view, that politics has to stay out of accounting standards. As soon as you do that, as soon as you make the statement, politics has to stay out, you shouldn't be saying this here in an academic environment, but in the political arena, because that's the only place where it matters. So it will be there, it's there, and that's not necessarily bad, but the main point is it will make accounting different, obviously. So apologies for getting back to the international standards, because I know there are other accounting issues that are also very important and politically influenced, but the IASB and IFRS as they are today are simply different, are not what they were because of the influence of politics. It's hard to believe these days, but one of the main arguments for introducing IFRS in the European Union was something like this. Well, we have this process of setting accounting directives, but it's very slow, it's very political, it takes a lot of time, so let's leave it to a group of experts who can do it quickly, who can quickly respond to situations. And now here we are, that it takes at least 10 years to come up with any major standard. So even though the label is still the same, the process has completely changed.
Just to react to what Kees was saying, I think the main reason why the IS regulation, why that got wide support was because all the options that had to be included in the directives, I don't think that the time frame as such was the issue, but it was just, there were so many options, and in each round of the political process there were other options to find a compromise, so there was no comparability whatsoever, and the idea to go for international standards was that the comparability would not only be in Europe but would be worldwide. So I think what we have seen, as I said, is that politics, yes, come in if we want it or not. What I find interesting sometimes, I try to reason myself if I see the Parliament, why, for instance, the Greens would be in favor of this, and against that I have difficulties to see the sort of the relation with the political color, I have to say. Can I a bit see the Liberals that they are sometimes on certain things are there, and perhaps sustainable finance, you can see that they Is it not? Is it? Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know what people heard or not heard. I was saying it was interesting to see what the political cause, the political groups, what kind of positions they take, and sometimes you can see a sort of logic if you say the Greens, okay, they want more on sustainable finance, long-term investment, but in other areas it's very difficult to see. Well, you probably don't want to hear the third time what I said, so I think I'm not going to say that again. So I think my conclusion was, yes, politics have influence, and yeah, if it's right or wrong, I think the problem is that it's not, in a way, not neutral. As I said, it's the people knocking on the doors are the people that have concerns, and it's, so in that way it's not balanced. And there's also what we see, for instance, if I just refer to our own finance regulation in one of the IFRS foundations and the PIOP, in that negotiation process where the Parliament and so come in, you get all kind of messages in it, reporting requirements, but also you have these preambles where they make a lot of messages where you even don't understand what it has to do with your organization or accounting, but it's a political important issue that they want to signal. So it's not neutral, but it's there, and it will be there, and we have to be accountable to them. And yeah, sometimes they have strange demands. I think one of the demands Stefano was referring to, that some politicians say that actually they should have the right to appoint the ISB board members for Europe because they give money. Well,
I have to come towards you because the mic is
now
not
it's
working.
not working at that side.
Yeah, it's working on this side. One last question from the audience that came up while panel members were reacting to each other. I have to see that I don't miss a hand, but I don't see a hand if I look correctly. So I think for the time I will then end the panel here. I would like to thank you all for coming, but I would like first of all to thank our 4 panel members for investing time in presenting this presentation. So thanks a lot, Kees, Stefano, and Saskia. And a final message from Begonia and me is, please think about the team, accounting and politics. If you have ideas, if you want to do research on it, write papers and submit to the special edition of Accounting in Europe. If you have questions about the topic, you can always email us, contact us, and we will reply. Of course, what we can't do is say, well, this is great, it will be published, because all submissions will go through a double-blind review process like all art journal articles. So, thank you for coming to the symposia. Spread the word about the special issue, and a last thank to our panel members. So thanks a lot. I wish you all a pleasant evening at the place close to the sea.